a turnover at halfway. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Clock at 10. Adams the off balance.
Oh, my goodness.
Two on the clock.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Basketball Fix. I am today's host, Ryan Tucker. And as always, I have the resident basketball expert in Josh Higgins and the likeable larrikin in Jeremy Darke with me on the pod today. Josh, Jez, how are you, boys?
How you going, Ryan, mate? Yeah, looking obviously forward to nearly wrapping up these NBL25 season previews. Obviously, the season is just around the corner, and obviously we're going to be diving into a lot more content over the next couple of weeks. But been very good, mate, and obviously congratulations on your wedding as well. Looking forward to diving on today's episode.
Likeable larrikin is an interesting intro for me. I don't know how much of a larrikin or how likeable I am, but maybe I'm the combination of a likeable larrikin, I guess. But I thought I was more of the basketball expert of this whole trio of ours, but fair enough.
Well, I'm saving the expertise to the next episode when we touch on the Tasmania Jack Jumpers.
There's no expertise needed in that, I don't think. It all speaks for itself.
Well, as Josh alluded to, it is coming towards the pointy end of the season, the pre-season. Only 3 weeks remaining until tip-off for NBL25, and we have two teams remaining in our NBL25 team previews. This episode will feature Melbourne United, a lot to talk about with the team that lost the grand final series last season. Now, Josh, I want to start with you, mate. The NBL24 recap, as I said, they lost the grand final to the Tasmania Jack Jumpers. It was maybe for them a season that could have been. What do you think? What do you reflect on this season for Melbourne United?
Yeah, obviously it's probably a little bit harsh to say, but I think they'll be absolutely kicking themselves as they didn't obviously walk away as the eventual champions in NBL 24. They finished the season with the best record in the league, 20 wins and only 8 losses as well. The only question I've got going into future seasons is the age demographic of their list. You know, a lot of older players on their roster and a lot of the younger guys as well who have been around for a couple of seasons or who have played their first season. I just think it's going to be really interesting as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing obviously what we think as well. But yeah, Jez, what are some of your thoughts, mate?
Yeah, I don't know. It was sort of a season of two halves for them, I think you hit it right on the button saying that they were in a window last year. I think they were the heavy favourites going in, a very, very stacked side. I think you sort of felt like you can't say it was an unsuccessful season. They did take out the minor premiership and they made it all the way to the grand final, to the fifth and final game. But I think with the team that they had and the team list that they had, they were expected to win the championship and win it comfortably. But it sort of really felt like a season of two halves for them. They played really, really strong up until about New Year's Eve, really. And then it started to fall away. They had that away stretch of games because of the Australian Open. And they actually went, including the finals, they went 10-9 in their final 19 games of the year and 6-5 in the final games of their regular season. So it sort of really shows they started really hard and were really, really strong, playing a lot of home games, and then went on the road and it was a little bit tougher. So it'll be interesting to see how they attack that, because it's very, very similar in NBL 25 and how they overcome that challenge and stay just as strong throughout the whole year. And like you said, with that maybe a little bit older roster, we'll see how it goes for Melbourne.
Yeah, definitely. And I just think I want to just touch on one last point as well. You know, we're touching on that sort of fade out, and obviously early on in the season, they're absolutely dominating the entire NBL realistically as well, in terms of whether it was at home or away. And then, you know, I think the fade out really contributed as well to even just the things as like the age demographic, which is the biggest thing realistically, which we'll touch on. You know, a lot of these guys started to get banged up towards the back end of the season. Matthew Dellavedova had his problems. Shea Illy had his problems. Goulding had his problems. You know, a lot of these soft tissue injuries, which we see very commonly, I guess, in these older sort of teams, are really starting to happen for Melbourne United. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they've attacked this off season, because whilst it hasn't been really, really busy, it's still been a relatively successful off season for United.
I've got a question around that, boys. So when you look at other sports, so say the NBA, the AFL, NRL, you'll see teams that are kind of at the higher end of the age bracket being most successful in championships. And obviously now with Melbourne getting to the grand final with the age they have, where do you kind of find that balance between having experienced veterans on your team, but also having enough younger players to be able to cover for the injuries and making sure you're making it through the whole season?
Yeah, I think like obviously you need the depth, and then it's management maybe throughout the year as well with certain amounts of minutes on the court during games, and then obviously different sets of recovery. I think that like finding that balance, I think experience in basketball, I think especially in the NBL is vital. Like if I was building a team, I would probably also be looking to bring in a lot of these sort of older guys because yeah, the season, especially the ones that have NBA experience and are used to playing really long, heavy seasons, then you go to the NBL and it's cut in half straight away with the amount of games, can obviously be very beneficial. Bringing guys over from the States or that are at the back end of their career that have played in that style of pressure basketball where it's really, really physical on your body. Because obviously you come into the NBL, also a very like defensive heavy league, but maybe not as physical as you would get in the NBA. So I think experience definitely, and it shows obviously with Melbourne United with some key older players in the older demographic because they did their job. They got to the final. They just fell at the final step. But I think it's very, very important to have these veteran players on your team, definitely. Josh, what are your thoughts, mate?
Yeah, I think it's just finding the right is always going to be the biggest thing with obviously older players and obviously younger players as well, because if you go too far one way, let's just talk young players, you got a lot of inexperience and a lot of questionable things. So you go the other way though, obviously with a lot of older players particularly, it's going to be very interesting to see obviously how they build going into future seasons, and yeah, it's going to be interesting obviously as we touch on NBL25 coming up.
Yes, and apologies if Josh's sound was cutting out a bit there. I think our connection might be struggling on the back end there. But let's look forward to NBL 25 and the player movement for this team, because there have been some major moves. And when we look at first the players that the team has lost, we have some really big names here, and a couple. We've spoken about this offline quite a bit, and the main one that I think Luke Travers, Josh, we did a quick pod about him earlier on this off season with some news about signing a two-way there with the Cavs. How do you see Travers kind of moving out of this team? Who comes in to fill that void, and what will he take with him out of this Melbourne United team?
Yeah, I just think obviously with Luke, it's hopefully that obviously news still happens with Luke, and he eventually does obviously go over to the NBA and can fulfill that dream as well. It hasn't been 100% announced just yet, but I think from reliable sources that I've heard from friends and family as well, I think that will happen at some stage for some particular team. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see, obviously, how they fill that void. You know, he's a guy who averaged 12 points per game last season to go with 7.6 rebounds. He's a really, really strong playmaker. He's a good defender. He's really good on the ball as well. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, obviously, how they replace the overall mix. And I think, in a way, at Melbourne United, he was sold the dream and not necessarily got to fulfill that dream as well. He was sold that he was going to be the point guard and have the ball in his hand, and he was going to have the flow of the offense on his hand. And I thought it was really going to work well. You know, you touch on like a Ben Simmons, for example, potentially going to a Golden State Warriors to team up with a Stephen Curry, for example. That's what I thought this would be with Luke and obviously Chris Golding as well. So it's going to be interesting to see, obviously, the mix going forward, because they've lost a really good talent. And it's not even just been a really good talent. This is a young guy who's still finding his feet in professional basketball as well, who's only 22 or 23 years of age. So there's a lot of development to still go, and I think they're going to be really kicking themselves in future seasons that they've lost him.
Most definitely. Another guy that they have lost, big JLA, Joe Luala-Chul. And Jez, you have a bit of a thought about what the movement of this player, who was only there for a year, but he'll leave a gaping hole in United. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, it was his second stint there, and this time just for 1 year after being there, what was it, 3 years earlier, or a couple of years earlier for a 3 year stint. But I think he is an integral part, has been an integral part of their offense and their game plan last season, along with, I guess the sort of the big guy partnership with Ariel Hukporti, who also is moving on. So it sort of has left, with both of those guys departing, you've left a very, very big hole in your offense and your defense. Like JLA averaged 7.7 points, 7.7 rebounds, and 1.4 blocks. So he was doing a lot on the offense and obviously setting up for pick and rolls and really sort of moving around these players. And he's going to be a big, big miss. And then it's the same type of thing with Hukporti as well, who actually got a 2-way contract with the Knicks recently in the off season. So I think missing these two guys has left, their center position and big forwards have obviously left a big hole, and they're going to need to be getting some rebounds from a lot of players and really sort of locking out down low. So, when it comes to their movements, which we'll chat on, of who they've brought in, I feel that these two losses could almost be as big as Travis as one loss. So, we'll see how it goes for them, missing these two big guys. But Josh, what are your thoughts, buddy?
Yeah, Ariel Hukporti is one that I am very interested. I think he is personally the biggest loss for Melbourne United this season. I think he's a guy who is building right, and I think he was always going to end up in the NBA at some sense, or he was going to be around the mark, I guess, as well. So for him to obviously eventually, finally move on and fulfill his dream of obviously playing in the NBA in a 2-way deal is massive for him. But I just think when we look at big men in the NBL, he's just the prototype. I don't think it's super important for a guy to be able to knock down the outside shot, but he's developing that. But he's also really, really strong inside. He can guard sort of 1, 2, 5 because of, I guess, his versatility as well in terms of being able to run guards off the perimeter as well. So I think he's nearly their biggest loss in terms of you're looking at future development. This is the guy who you could sit around and really build a team around. So he's a guy who, let's just say the NBA dream doesn't work out. He might come back to, obviously, the NBL at some stage, but yeah, he's going to be a very heavily signatured and heavily interested player as well going forward. But Joe Lawala-Chul, I think he's sort of coming to the end of his career in a way. I think he's obviously going out there and trying to chase money. I think that's the biggest thing for him. But I realistically think as well, you didn't see the best of Joe last year. There was games where he had the best and you saw the MVP numbers. And, there was a game, I think he had 20, 10, and 7 blocks or something around that, or it was 19, 9, and 7 blocks. He's had some monster stat lines, but I just think, it's going to be interesting to see how they obviously fulfill that. And they've obviously brought in a centre that we'll touch on and another sort of power forward centre later on as well. So it's going to be interesting, but more from we're touching on, obviously, I guess, losing some of these older, experienced guys. Brad Newley's another one who leaves the NBL world entirely and retires from the NBL. An incredible career, an Olympian as well, Commonwealth Games guy as well. He's been a really, really strong servant for Australian basketball and obviously the NBL for such a long period of time. And he leaves with obviously a great career behind him. And I think he's going to be a guy who will be missed because when we're touching on leadership, there's certain players who they may not go on the court, and you may wonder, why is he even in the team still if this is what the sort of game plan is or the rotation is for him? But it's what they give you off the court in the training schedule. So it's going to be interesting, obviously, to see how they go with him going forward, because I think he's crucial to, obviously, the development of them going forward. He's going to be around in some sense as well. I believe he's taken up a job with Melbourne United in the front office. So he'll be poking his head around as well and floating around and obviously being with these young guys, developing them. And I think he's going to be missed in terms of off the court, but on the court, he's not very much of a miss anyways.
Well, touching on players that they have brought in, they have made a few signings and possibly at an attempt, or depending on how you look at it, to fill the holes of the guys that they have lost. The first one I want to touch on, Jez, is Jack White. Now, quite a versatile player. How do you see him fitting into this United team? What will he bring to try and, as I said, fill the gaps that they have here from the players they've lost?
Yeah, well, I think Jack White could have possibly. It was up there as one of the biggest signings of the off season for any team, and he was. It obviously was directly related to the Luke Travis news that he wasn't going to be signing and was going to be chasing his NBA options. So they brought in Jack White, who is a very, very similar player. He's got so much pedigree from last time when he was playing for Melbourne United a few years ago. Went over and was on a two-way deal with the Nuggets, and didn't play a lot of minutes for the Nuggets, but I think it was still about 15 games or something for 3 or 4 minutes per game, but was still a part of that championship run where they won the NBA. So that's definitely his claim to fame. But during that same season, he was incredible for their G League team, the Grand Rapids Gold. He averaged 19.6 points a game, 9.3 rebounds. So very, very close to a very fine double-double, really, in averages in that season. So he had a little bit more of a quiet season last year. He did get moved on and was in the Lakers system, but didn't really play there much. Didn't get as much time and wasn't as productive as he was when he was playing for the Nuggets affiliate. But now he gets his opportunity. Melbourne, coming back to Melbourne, obviously an organisation where he's very, very comfortable and has a lot of faith in. But Josh, what sort of my big question around White is what the difference is going to be really between the Jack White that left and chased his NBA dream to the Jack White that they've gotten back now for NBL25.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be, I guess it's just more development maybe as well. And I think leadership will come into it as well. You know, you look at his last NBL season in NBL 21, he had averages of 9.3 points and 7.1 rebounds. Now that was coming off a very short and interrupted preseason as well, because in his sort of first NBL season, he had an Achilles injury which ruled him out for the rest of that season. He was really starting to find his feet in that first NBL season as well, back in NBL 21. So realistically, he was starting to build nicely in NBL 22, and that was the reason why he got these chances over in the NBA. And I think we're really going to see a complete player come back to the NBL in the next couple of seasons, and obviously this season as well. Very disappointing that, we're not going to see potentially him and Luke Travers in the same team, but I just think at the end of the day, these sort of guys that you can bring back to your club who are going to be top locals are really, really important in terms of if you're wanting to build that long sustained success in the NBL. And when we're touching on this sort of refresh, sort of rebuild for Melbourne United, it really does come down to guys like Jack White, who can obviously, be able to build. He's played under some great players. You look at obviously the NBA world, he's played under a Nikola Jokic. Even back in his NBL days, he was playing under Jock Landale and Joel Luala-Chul. So very top level sort of players in every league that he's been to, and obviously had that development pathway as well in terms of the NBL and the NBA. And he comes back obviously under Dean Vickerman, who is a really, really strong coach and continues to put his best foot forward as well in that sort of coaching ring as well. So I just think it's all signs pointing to the right choice, I think, for Melbourne United. Obviously, he was always going to come back to the NBL and play for Melbourne if that was the case. But it's really exciting to see a top-level talent sort of leaving the G League bubble as well, where you don't really get to see too much of them, and coming back to the NBL as well and having a massive crack to eventually probably, pushing himself back into the NBL ranks.
Yeah, how do you think he fits into that lineup defensively? Because obviously he's been known to be quite a versatile defender. He can defend down low at 5, but he can also, fill the gap of being sort of the key defender. How do you think he's going to fit in working with, say, Delhi and Goulding, and where do you think he'll fit in their defensive structure?
Yeah, we'll obviously touch on, the next player, and, I'll leave his name for just a second, but I think he's going to work very well as that sort of power forward center combination that they've obviously trying to build going into future seasons. And I just think the way that he plays, it doesn't matter where he is. You can put him on, you can play him in a zone, you can play him in man-to-man. Even when you're playing zone, you can put him on, on the point guard, shooting guard combination at the top of the key or at the three-point line. So I just think in terms of what he's going to bring defensively, I wouldn't be too worried about it, because he's going to bring a lot right. And I think it's obviously going to be really important to them if he is obviously being able to guard 1 to 5, because he's such a versatile player. And I just think the way that you look at it is, first couple of seasons in the NBL, he just averaged just under a block a game and just under a steal a game. So they're really competitive sort of numbers and statistics when you're looking at obviously great players in the NBL. And I think he's really starting to build that sort of resume in the NBA and in the NBA G League as being a really solid defender, because I've seen a lot of videos of him this off season. He's very, very quick on his toes, which is super important. You know, when you're looking at a guy who's 6'8", 6'9", to be able to do that is incredible. So I haven't really got too many questions on Jack White. I just think it's going to be how they sort of use him in the system, because I think in a way you've got to sort of start to fade out Chris Golding, and you've got to start to make a guy, maybe it's Jack White, as that number one option on offense as well, because he's definitely capable of that. He's definitely capable of being a, let's just say an 18 to 20 points per game with a, 9 to 12 rebounds a game as well, sort of guy in the NBL, because that's the caliber player that he is.
Do you think that he's capable of, if he has a good season this year, do you think he goes back to the NBA though?
I think that will be his goal personally. So I think that's his goal entirely, is to use this again as a stop to be able to have a great season and potentially buffer his way into the NBA, because I think he's made that very well known that he wants to go back to the NBA and he wants to be in those sort of systems, because I think once you get there and you taste the NBA championship success that he obviously had, that's addicting for a lot of players. And some players, it's opposite. They've had that. They're like, okay, that's cool. Let's go make some money. Let's have an increased role. Let's be a star player around the world. But I think a guy like Jack, I don't think he is, personally from looking from afar, satisfied with just obviously one proper season in the NBA and then obviously G League contracts as well. So I entirely think that if he has a big season here, there'll be a lot of NBA interest. And if that interest is there, he'll be definitely over in America playing for the NBA team.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. I think he's too old. They're not going to take a chance on a 28 or 28 or 29, however old he'll be once this season's over and the next NBA season's coming along. I think for Jack, the best thing for his career would be to knuckle down and find a place in the NBL where he can see out, the next 10 years and be an integral part of a franchise and probably set himself up for a life after basketball. But it will be interesting to see, no doubt, how he contributes to this team and what role he plays. Another guy they've brought in, Marcus Lee, a champion of the NBL from last season from the Jack Jumpers, moves to the team that he beat. We have a lot of chit-chat in the locker room, I would assume, as he comes in there with his medal or ring around his finger. Jez, how do you see Marcus Lee fitting into this team?
Yeah, look, he obviously comes in as the number one centre. Played obviously in Melbourne the year before. He went to Tasmania, so he's come back home as the prodigal son, but with a championship ring around his finger instead of a championship loss. So I don't know, with Marcus Lee obviously being a Jack Jumpers fan and coming into that final series, I felt the back half of the year he wasn't as strong for me. I was much happier going through the playoffs when you had Magnay and even Dang working together and on the court at the same time, with Lee being on the bench. But he obviously was very, very integral part of that incredible defensive structure that the Jack Jumpers did have. He has was the sixth or seventh highest defensive rating in the league. So obviously doing something right, and that was a very, very key part. But I just felt offensively when the Jack Jumpers needed points and needed to score, that I didn't feel as confident with Lee. Obviously only averaging 6 points a game and 6 rebounds, but that wasn't obviously his job. But it felt like pushing for the championship, that was more what the Jack Jumpers did need in that final run, and they obviously got it from Magnay, who had an amazing final series. So I think he will play an integral part, and obviously working with in the Melbourne defensive system, I think it's going to be interesting to see how he plays and how they use him as their number one centre. But it's obviously going to be to lock out down low and be that guy for them. So I don't know, Josh, what are your thoughts on Lee and how he's going to fit in? I'm mostly interested in how he'll fit in there defensively in that structure there.
Yeah, and I think with Marcus Lee, you've got to obviously throw it back to a couple of seasons ago. Now, he started with Melbourne United for that team under Dean Vickerman before obviously making the move to the Tasmanian Jack Jumpers in that eventual championship season. I think Dean really, really likes Marcus Lee, and there's a massive reason as to why obviously he's come back for another go at Melbourne United. Now, the questions that I've got with Marcus Lee, and it's been his biggest question so far in his NBL career, in his very short NBL career, and it's always been, can he stay out of foul trouble? Because you see what he can do in really, really quick succession. He turns games on his head because he's such a strong defender. But I think he's a bit of a sloppy and slow defender as well in some situations, and that's where he does get caught out. So a guard will get, in the paint really, really quickly and really will stop him in his tracks in a way. And instead of obviously getting the correct positioning, just because he's a little bit slower than some of these other athletic centers, he finds himself in these bad positions and giving up very cheap fouls as well. So there's often been games where he goes out there, and Scott Roth last season was a very old school coach in some senses as well. If you got 2 fouls in the first quarter, you might not see the court for the rest of the half. So, it's going to be interesting to see obviously the more trust that Dean Vickerman may have in him, being the fact that he is the sort of main guy and maybe the only guy as well coming into this season as a true bona fide center. But I just think what he can produce in terms of the system is really, really strong, because when you watch him on the court, he's very loud, he's very vocal. He was telling these players where they've got to be, how they've got to be. You hear him on the screens, hard screen right, hard screen left. He's really, really vocal. So in terms of the leadership and the communication that he's going to bring, I think it's going to be paramount to obviously their successes in NBL25. But it's going to be interesting to see if they can keep him on the court long enough, because I don't think Jack White is going to be super, super strong defensively without Marcus Lee, because we've seen what Jack in the NBL can do. If he's got Jock Landale behind him, he's a different player. If he's got Joe Lawala-Chill behind him, he's a different player, because he's not having to guard that number one big every single night. It does help him. We touched on him as well. Yep, Jack's a very solid defender, but he works well in the system. And that's the big thing with Marcus Lee. Marcus Lee is a really good system defender, and we saw that for the Jack Jumpers last season. And I think as well, if Magnay wasn't there, I think we would have seriously seen another Marcus Lee sort of role last year, because I think everyone towards the back end of the year just wanted to see Will Magnay go out there and play 40 minutes per game. And I was one of those people, because he's just so exciting. So maybe that also, in the back of our heads needs to be forgotten about, that yet Will is a different sort of beast. But Marcus was doing his role very well, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how he goes, because I think we're going to see the best of Marcus Lee this season, and I'm looking forward to it for sure.
Josh, another player that you have been interested in that's come into the United system is Akecha Lear. What have you kind of got to provide our listeners with for information on Lear?
Yeah, Alir is a teammate in NBL1 with Nick Marshall, who's a guy who we've interviewed obviously on the show, and shout out Nick. And I remember touching, and I can't remember if it was on air or off air, about obviously some of the other players that that Nick had been playing with in the NBL1 season. But I remember him saying that Alir is going to have a massive impact for some NBL team this year, and he needs to be signed up very, very quickly. So he played for the Mount Gambier Pioneers, obviously over in Adelaide, and put up averages this NBL1 season of 18.5 points per game to go with 10 rebounds, 1.5 assists, 1.4 blocks, and just under 1 steal a game. So he was dominant. He was up there as well as a chance to take out the MVP. I think he was up there in the Defensive Player of the Year. He made the All-Star 5 for them as well. He just really come in with an exciting sort of resume, I guess, to come into NBL 25 season. And he's only 24 years of age, which is even more exciting, because he's only starting to really find his straps now as well. So you bring him under Dean Vickerman, who I call, a bit of a master in some sense as well, who's developed some of these big guys into being really, really critical and I guess crucial players in the system. I think he's going to be a really, really important player for them. So I think this is a really underrated signing. I think when we're touching obviously on, what Lee's going to bring and what White's going to bring, he's the sort of third piece in the cog in a sense as well, to be able to sort of help out and I guess sort of shoulder some of the load as well for those guys. So I'm not sure what his role will be, or if he's going to have a really dominant role for Melbourne United this season. But I think at some stages he's going to have some big games and some big moments, and really, I guess, stamp his authority and show everyone that he belongs in the NBL world.
How much game time do you reckon he's going to play? So I'm just thinking from a super coach perspective, he might be. Was trying to bring up his his price now while I'm looking at this. That obviously, if he's not going to play a lot of minutes, maybe he's not a good shot. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think he's definitely going to play minutes. I just think you've got to play these guys who have had good sort of NBL 1 seasons, because he wouldn't have signed to Melbourne for any other reason than the fact that they would have guaranteed him some sort of minutes in his contract, and obviously the chance that he's going to be developing with some of the greatest players. So when we're touching on obviously this sort of, I guess, weird transition between some of the older guys and the newer guys, I think he's the perfect guy to come in and really have a bit of an impact. He's probably going to be the 8th or 9th man come off the bench at the start and really start to build those minutes up. But he's a guy who I can really look at and go, yeah, he's going to bring something different. He's very, very athletic, and he's very, very exciting to watch. So I think all things are pointing to the direction that he will play. And yeah, he's definitely a super coach Smokey as well. And we're going to be touching on that very, very soon.
58,500 on Supercoach, right?
Basement price. Get on him. Lock him in. And they've got the best, not to give too much Supercoach content away, but they have got the best run to start the season as well. So that is a lock here. You've heard it first from the Basketball Fix.
There you go. Now, guys, we've touched on the players. We've looked at the NBL 24 season. Now, let's look ahead. What do they need to be successful in NBL 25 to recreate the run, to have that winning record that they did and effectively blasted a lot of teams out of the water in the season? We're looking at things like obviously the player movement and replacing the big men in the team. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, boys, if they've managed to kind of hit their targets in the off season, and what do you see them kind of focusing on over the next few months into the first half of the season? Josh, we'll go with you first.
Yeah, I think they've done it in a certain sense. I just think it's very hard to replace Joe Lawala-Chul and Ariel Hook-Porty in terms of the big man sort of rotation, and I don't think they've 100% nailed that. Whilst Marcus Lee is very good, you've got to remember that JLA and Ariel Hook-Porty were basically, Hook-Porty was a next star and JLA was classed as a local. So you're having to use an import spot to cover what they've been able to give you over the last couple of seasons. And you haven't really, I guess, got in the caliber player that those two guys are, in my opinion. So I just don't think they've nailed that down. And, we could be proven wrong, and Marcus Lee could be a guy who could come out and average 15 and 10. That is, I think, the sort of highest ceiling that you're going to get out of a guy like Marcus Lee. And that's very good in the NBL. But I just don't think they've nailed down the center rotation. But in terms of, obviously, I guess, trying to transition in between, the mid-30s to late 30s guys like Delhi, Chris Goulding, and obviously guys like Brad Newley as well. And, you can even throw Shay Lee into that as well. They've done that in some sense. They've obviously brought in some young talent to obviously start to, I guess, form the rebuild. But then obviously you're losing probably the most exciting talent as well in terms of age demographic with Luke Travis. So I just think it's been one of those off seasons when we look at these top teams. A lot of them have either sort of lost things and maybe gained things as well because they know where their rotation's at. But maybe I'm interested to see what you're thinking, Jez, but are they starting to have a little bit of an identity crisis in terms of they don't know which way they should go? Should they sort of clean the slate out a little bit and bring in a lot of new guys as well to sort of get that rebuild going? Or are they trying to sort of stay relevant as well, a bit like the Geelong Cats in the AFL?
It seems to have worked for the Geelong Cats a little bit, though, really, hasn't it? You thought that they were done a while ago, and now all of a sudden they've had an amazing season this year. But that's another pod for another time. But I think it's a lot of it is a bit of sideways movement. Or the idea was more sideways movement, like you said. They have their systems in place. They know what works. It obviously worked for them last year, and now they're just looking for maybe a cut, clear replacement. But I agree with you there that it has missed the mark a little bit. You're looking for a sideways movement, but it feels like they have dipped a little bit, especially in the centres. I think when it comes to Luke Travis and the Jack White switch, I think like Jack White's ceiling could be really, really high. He could be a little bit more productive on offense, maybe than what Travis was. I think, but it's all this, I think, and possibility. I don't think coming from the path that he's taken, where he was at the sort of peak of his career there in his first season away, and then sort of dropping off a little bit, and now having to come back into the NBL system with a goal in mind just to get back to where he was. I think that's a very, very dangerous position, where you've got Luke Travis that's really pushing at his pinnacle and in sort of the prime of his development, and was fantastic for United all year. So yeah, it is tough. I think that they have what they have, but they're going to need at some stage to really focus on this rebuild for the longevity of the club. A little bit like what Ryan touched on. I think you've got to start working towards the future a little bit, and working on getting some of these development players or these younger players in, and building your team around them, instead of, okay, we've got this older crowd and now we're just trying to do a clean switch. So for me, their off-season was a little bit of a miss, but they haven't fallen too far behind with who they've brought in, because they've brought in some really high caliber players.
Well, I think there's no doubt that this team will be there or thereabouts in NBL 25. They have a solid roster, a great coach, and the pedigree of winning sticks around in an organisation like this for years to come. So I don't think we'll see United take too far of a step back. There aren't really many teams, I don't think either, that are coming up to the level of United and those other teams at top. So they'll be top four, in my opinion, to close out the season. Now, guys, as we've done for all NBL teams through our previews, we give them a grading for the off-season, and we take into account the player movement. We take into account whether they've had any changes in coaching or anything that's come out from the clubs in terms of their style of play or direction. With Melbourne United, it's going to be difficult, as we've kind of alluded to already, to you don't change a winning team so much. So as we've seen with the Perth Wildcats and other teams, their gradings were kind of mid-level. But I'm interested to hear anyway about your thoughts on an off-season grading for Melbourne United. Josh, I'll go with you first, mate. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I just think obviously they haven't really nailed the off-season in a sense. I think they've lost probably more than what they've gained. I think, like we've touched on all episode, I think, Luke is a better player overall, I think, personally, than what Jack White is. I think obviously Marcus Lee is not even close to Ariel Hook-Porty, let alone Ariel Hook-Porty and Joe Lawala-Chul. Obviously some young guys that they've brought in, they've got a lot of, I guess, potential, but it's obviously reaching that potential as well, obviously every NBL season. So, obviously I think C realistically is when we look at it and we could go, okay, what they've lost, they've sort of gained in a sense as well. And I don't think they have. So in a sense, I'm going to go obviously a little bit lower than that. So I'm going to give them a D+ for myself personally. I just don't think it's been a great off season, because when you don't bring in, the same class both ways, you can't really get much more than a pass grade, which is obviously a C.
Jez, what's your grade on the United team this off season?
I think that's like an interesting concept, where you sort of say that you're going from working on the balance of a team not getting any better. But I don't know. In my opinion, I think it was really tough for Melbourne to get better, because they had obviously some really, really high caliber players, and then the ability for them to bring in players maybe at the same level was very, very tough. But I still think they have brought in high caliber players that can definitely do a job. But maybe it just wasn't to the exact same level. But they're still, if you would compare them to some of the buys in for some of the other teams that were sort of atrocious and meaningless, I think these buys have been, or these swapped players really have been still at an extremely high caliber. So, I think for me, I'm going to give them a B-, because I still think the quality of player that they have brought in, although a little bit less, is still at an extremely high level. So, definitely a B-, because it was above average with the quality that's coming.
And I'm going to go a C+-ish. I think that as you both alluded to there.
Sit on the fence, Ryan, right in between the two of us. That a boy.
Exactly.
That a boy. Do what your best at, mate.
It's quite. Thanks for the encouragement there. It is a lot of sideways movement in the players, but I don't believe they could have done much better. And I think they've brought in guys that will fit into the system and be able to play the style of basketball they want to play. So I don't think it's, hey, come and help us out of this hole, but I don't see where they maybe could have done much better with these guys that wanted to move on. And I think we have a last reflection on off-season grades from Josh.
Yeah, just one obviously on what sort of Jez was sort of alluding to in a way, obviously in terms of who they've brought in and why they've done it. I just think a big thing with Melbourne United over the last couple of seasons is they're spending a lot of money on local talent. And I think, it's worked well in the past, but when you've got a lot of money sort of tied up to guys like Chris Goulding, to guys like Matthew Dellavedova, even guys like Shea Ili, for example, as well, you're sort of, I guess, hamstringing yourself to a certain extent to not be aggressive and go after some of these import players. If you look back to last season, they've only had the one import player. They had Ian Clark, who was obviously the sixth man of the year, had a really, really crucial role. But because they haven't been able to go out there and spend a lot of money on some of these top, international players, I just think obviously it's a big thing as well when they go forward. So, whilst we're touching on obviously Marcus Lee being really, really impressive and really, really exciting, it would have been really nice to see them go out there and I think realistically go and grab someone who really catches the eye in terms of a statistical standpoint, or maybe who we've seen somewhere else in the NBL as well. You touch on guys who have come back to the NBL. A guy like Cam Oliver, I think, would suit their play style a lot more in terms of I think they're going to want to play, a little bit more fast basketball as well. I think they've got to really pass the ball around. A guy like Marcus Lee is very limited on the offensive end as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see, obviously, how they do structure their team this season, because we've got to remember, Chris Goulding's not getting any younger. Matthew Dellavedova's not getting any younger. They're starting to get to that age now where they've probably only got a year or two left in them of really high competitive basketball before the fadeaway comes very quickly as well. So it's going to be interesting, and it's very good to obviously see a couple of different grades on here as well and sort of see where we rank these teams as well.
And they still have a spot open for a local and even a next star on this roster. Well, boys, that brings us to, if I do the right graphic, there we go, the end of today's episode surrounding the Melbourne United basketball team. We have one episode left of our previews, and it is the champions, the Tasmania Jack Jumpers, will be coming up next. Josh, where can you find all the Basketball Fix content if you are keen to listen, watch, read?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, you can check us out on wherever you get your podcasts from, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, all that sort of good stuff as well. Make sure you check us out on YouTube, The Basketball Fix. Check us out on Instagram as well to keep up to date with all the biggest news, topics, and articles as well over there. And obviously checking out our website as well, www.thebasketballfix.com. Obviously, a lot of content's been coming out recently. Most recently, I've sat down with Mark Arena and Christian Doolittle, the new Perth Wildcats owner and star import for Perth Wildcats as well. So make sure you go check those episodes out, and obviously go back and check out the rest of these NBL25 season previews, because there's been a lot of content, a lot of banter, and a lot of fun as well. So it's sort of sad that we're at that last episode now coming up with the Tasmanian Jack Jumpers, but it obviously means the season is another week closer, and we can't wait for that.
And don't forget to look out for Josh or any of us trawling the internet forums, asking for questions to pose to our interviewees throughout the coming months. Jez, we alluded a little bit earlier to an NBL Supercoach episode or series of episodes. What can our listeners expect to have on those episodes?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to start off. There's been a massive increase in Supercoach players from over the last couple of years since it got taken over by the Telegraph. So me being one of them, always played AFL, NRL Supercoach, and now I'm coming in to kick Josh's ass in NBL Supercoach because he thinks he is one of the elite. But what we're going to do really is have a bit of a chat for all of these like different rules and the differences between the two super coaches to start with, and then we'll start chatting about how our views and opinions of how to build the best team coming into the season. And yeah, definitely not really listening too much to what Josh has to say about that, because he's old news now. The new school's coming in.
I'm definitely looking forward to having both of you guys under the arm this year as well, boys, and obviously babying you guys along the whole way, and obviously our listeners as well. But yeah, I'm super excited to obviously get into the Supercoach world, because I've probably looked at my team at least 4 or 5 times a day, and we're not even close to the start of the season. So yeah, looking forward to delivering that content, and obviously kicking both your guys' asses as well, which is always fun.
Love it. All right, guys, thanks for listening, and we hope you've gotten your basketball fix.
Which stars come to play? He's the biggest of them all. Step back, 4-3. Phoenix forced a turnover at halfway. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Clock at 10. Adams the off balance. Oh,